The Halli Casser-Jayne Show airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. The podcast's always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. I want to ask you about choice. What about choice? Is the brain hijacked by the predisposition, or is it choice? And what about choice?
I think that the brain is not hijacked. I think it's more like you fell in love with a drug as opposed to a person. And when you fall in love, your behavior gets skewed towards that person in some ways that can sometimes be a bit crazy, just the way people can be a bit crazy about seeking drugs. And you can see the exact same behavior in people who are in love that is somehow thwarted and in people who are addicted. I mean, you can even see like withdrawal symptoms when people get dumped. So does this mean that you have no choice but to have an affair, or you have no choice but rob a drugstore or something? No. It just means that you have a skewed valuation system in your brain that makes you more likely to make that choice than you would be otherwise.
Shocking. There is no other way to put it. Just the idea of someone shooting a needle laced with heroin into their vein is enough to make one shiver. Yet, more and more Americans are in fact shooting up and getting addicted to other drugs as well. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we talk to a woman who herself was a heroin addict, who turned her life around and is now considered one of the premier American journalists covering addiction and drugs. Her name is Maia Szalavitz. Her story, compelling. Her new book, sparking controversy, Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction. Maia will be with me in a moment, but first, welcome. I am your host, Halli Casser-Jayne. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by visiting my website at HalliCasser-Jayne.com and clicking on the Audible.com icon for your free book. Hey, what's more fun than a free book? And while you're there, explore our ads and support the show with a click on the links offered. We want to welcome our new partner, our favorite store, the finest in offering gourmet foods, Dean and DeLuca. And remember, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com and a host of venues including Stitcher.com, Spreaker.com, TuneIn Radio, iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, and on the iHeart Radio Network. Former heroin user Maia Szalavitz is one of the premier American journalists covering addiction and drugs. Her book, Help at Any Cost, was the first book-length expose of the tough love business that dominates addiction treatment, particularly for teens. Her work often appears in publications such as the New York Times, Scientific American, Elle, Vice, and New York Magazine, among others. She's a 2015-2016 Soros Justice Fellow. In her new book, Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, Szalavitz is sparking controversy, forcing the addiction movement to reassess some of its long-held beliefs. What better time to take a look at itself? Addiction is rampant in our society, with heroin and painkiller overdoses dominating headlines and more Americans fighting addictive behavior than ever. With marijuana legalization almost certain to spread domestically, and with the UN considering softening international drug laws for the first time, clarity on this issue is desperately needed. Let's talk. Maia, I have many friends in Alcoholics Anonymous with a whole lot of years of sobriety, and when I told them about your new book, I'm not going to lie, I heard, she's a quack, she's a charlatan, she's dangerous, she's a quack, she's... Oh, gosh, right? She's messing with the minds of addicts. In other words, Maia, with Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, you know that you're up against an entrenched belief in the addiction movement, not to mention a business model that has worked for many, and you might be messing with the brains of recovering addicts, according to some of those people. What say you?
Well, I'd like to say first, I am in no way opposed to 12-step programs, and I think that the people for whom they work fabulously. People should just go on doing what works for them. What I am saying is that the example I tend to use is about cancer. If you have cancer, your oncologist and your support group are very different people. And in addiction treatment, unfortunately, we've conflated the two. But I'm not an expert on brain cancer because I've had brain surgery. And simply going through addiction recovery does not make you an expert on all things addiction. So I think the problem has been that we have people who think that they are qualified to treat mental illness and all kinds of other things that accompany addictions. And they've been given this authority by a treatment system which actually violates AA's own AIDS tradition and charges for what you can get for free in any church basement. I'm just saying we should let treatment be treatment, let AA be AA, and let everyone live happily ever after.
So I want to start with the definition of addiction, at least the old version of what the definition of addiction is, what you might call at least an old way of thinking. Talk to me.
There are many different ways of defining addiction, and in the past, it has been primarily focused on having physical dependence on something and suffering withdrawal symptoms when you no longer have access to the substance. The problem with that definition is that it makes cocaine not addictive and makes Prozac addictive. And lots of people would argue that that is a terrible way to define addiction for that reason, since everybody post-crack knows that cocaine is seriously addictive. So when you quit cocaine, you may be irritable and anxious and all kinds of things like that, but you're not puking and shaking in the obvious way that you would be when you quit heroin or alcohol. And so people sort of took that to be the model for all addictions, and hence we got in the 80s, cocaine is not addictive, which is definitely not true. With Prozac, on the other hand, I probably am physically dependent on Prozac in the sense that if I stop taking it, I will probably get depressed again. Does this mean I'm addicted to Prozac? I'm not compulsively using it despite negative consequences, which is my definition and the DSM's definition of addiction. So I would argue no.
Okay. So say this again. Your definition of addiction is?
Compulsive behavior despite negative consequences.
Okay. And let's clarify. If you succumb to addiction, does that make you weak, a victim of your own compulsions, or simply ill, or D, all of the above?
I would say it means that you have learned to love the wrong thing and that you have a learning disorder. If you want to call a learning disorder a disease, some people would argue with you, but I will not. I do not believe addiction is a choice. I am not saying people with addiction are bad people. I am just saying that the way the disease concept has been framed has basically supported drug policy that harms people with addiction. Because right now, addiction is the only disease that is treated with criminalization or faith-based treatment. And when people see a condition treated unlike anything else in medicine, and people are trying to argue it's a disease, but the treatment is prayer and confession, people are going to be like, it's not really a disease. It's obviously a moral problem.
Interesting, moral problem. Before we get into that, I think we need to define this, learning disorder. Everybody's got a learning disorder these days. I mean,
yes,
right?
Well, I see it as having your brain wired somewhat differently. And the important characteristics of this are that these conditions tend to occur at a certain point in development. For example, autism appears in early childhood typically. Schizophrenia appears in, adolescence and early adulthood. And it tends to be specific to one form of learning. So if you have ADHD, you have problems with attention, but you don't have necessarily problems with intelligence overall. Dyslexia, obviously, is a very specific problem with reading. There's dyscalculia, which I may have mispronounced, but that is a similar problem with math. But basically, these are things that are differences during development that can cause problems, but that also are sometimes associated with gifts as well.
Okay, but so this interests me because when you say, first of all, learning disorder, first of all, the word disorder I don't quite get that. But could two people growing up in the same house in the same family, right, who were being taught similarly, at least at home, of course, life experience kind of messes people up because different things happen to different people at different times. But in couching all of this under learning disorder, I'm still not exactly clear why A has it versus B doesn't.
Well, genetics is a big piece.
Okay, so that's something we need to talk about.
Like people don't develop autism because of bad parenting. I hope nobody would believe that these days. Most of these conditions have strong genetic influences, and they also have environmental influences in some cases. In the case of addiction, severe childhood trauma is very much implicated in a lot of addiction. 2/3 of people with addiction have at least one severely traumatic experience, and the more traumatic your childhood, the higher your risk is for addiction. So there's a big connection between trauma and addiction, and there's also a big connection between addiction and other learning disorders and other psychiatric illnesses.
I'm going to say this is kind of out there, but you're a smart woman. I know you can understand where I'm going with this, because it's something that I have come to understand. And I do think that when you suffer severe abuse, for instance, it actually can almost literally change your DNA.
Well, yeah, epigenetically, that is accurate. There is a bunch of research that shows that early life trauma and lack of nurture actually turns on different sets of genes than a more nurturing childhood would. And that makes a lot of evolutionary sense, because if an animal is going to be facing a very stressful world, you want the genes that work best under stress to be on. Whereas if the animal is going to be facing a sort of more nurturing and predictable world, you want the genes that work in those situations on. And unfortunately for people who have child trauma, the genes that work best when you're under stress can sometimes limit your cognitive abilities. Fortunately, a lot of this is reversible, but people are smarter when they feel safe and comfortable, basically.
Yeah. You've been very honest about your own history of addiction, and I want to talk about it. I want to use you as a model, right? Why not, right? So I want to talk about from the beginning. I want you to tell us about your family history and your early childhood. Was it a happy or an unhappy beginning? Did you as a child have behavior disorders that showed up early, or is there anything in your history that would lead to, is a clue to your own road to drug abuse? Give us a background on that. I think it's fascinating.
I'll just put it this way. When I was 3 years old in 1968, I was put on Ritalin. It was only very briefly, and it was because I was sort of overwhelmed by sensory experience, like lights were too bright, sounds were too loud. I couldn't deal with new tastes or textures. I didn't like to be touched. Today, I probably would have been diagnosed as Asperger's, but that diagnosis didn't exist back then, so I got the ADHD label. But it was also clear when I was 3 in 1968, I was also reading. So I was a smart kid. And so a lot of my oddness was sort of put down to intelligence. I was very isolated and lonely. I would not say I had a bad childhood, though, because I really enjoyed my intellectual obsessions. I was really into, opera and science fiction. I wanted to be a symphony conductor for a while. I would just get into these intellectual obsessions very, very deeply and sort of lose myself in them. But unfortunately, I also came to believe that I was a bad person because I was much more interested in these obsessions than I was in other people. And that made me a target of bullies because I was always talking about weird things, and I was socially clueless. And so, I stood out very early.
So the clue here is not fitting in.
Basically, yeah. I mean, and if you look at the data that, the research that follows people, what they call longitudinally over time, you'll see that, the people on the extremes are the ones at the highest risk. Now, they could be on the opposite extreme. For example, a very, very shy, anxious kid is kind of the opposite of a very bold, courageous kid, but both of them are at higher risk. And this is why the idea of an addictive personality breaks down, because a lot of people have one or two traits that raise risk, but very few people have all of them, and some of them are opposite to each other, so it would be sort of a very difficult personality to have.
Interesting. Listen, I never thought I'd ask a former drug user to use their experience to qualify their thesis, but here we go, right?
Tell us about your introduction to drugs and how you progressed to the use of heroin and cocaine use.
Well, I will say this. It was the 80s. I come from Generation X, which is the druggiest generation in history, not the boomers. And in 1978 to 82, which is when I was in high school, those were the peak years of drug use in America. In fact, at around that time, 50% of young adults tried cocaine. And that's not just in New York City. That's an astonishing figure. That's from the National Household Survey on Drug Use and Health. And, these are large national surveys that have been conducted annually for a really long time. So this is kind of like the best data we have. So there was a lot of drug use going on. And I remember just sort of being in, 7th grade and having drug education and being told that, peers are going to pressure you to do drugs. And I thought, well, that must mean that drugs are cool. So if I'm going to be able to be cool, I'm going to have to do some drugs. And I they gave you this information alcohol makes you physically out of control and cigarettes cause cancer. But marijuana sounded really interesting. So I decided that if I ever was peer pressured, I would go for the marijuana. And then, of course, I was actually at that time still so socially isolated that nobody would pressure me. But when I got to high school, I found friends that were involved with psychedelics, which I had become sort of fascinated by at the time. And I got into the whole Grateful Dead scene. And that was where I was introduced to cocaine, actually.
So for a smart girl, not so smart.
Well, yes, although, the thing is, and I think this is really important. For one, there's a lot of data showing that smart people are more likely to try drugs than other people. And I think the reason for this is that intellectual openness and curiosity is often associated with intelligence, which also makes you at risk for trying things that you should not try. The other thing I want to point out in terms of this is just that if kids are, sort of experimenting with things, the vast majority of them do not become addicted.
I know that that's part of what you talk about in the book, and I hold off on that for a second because there's another question I want to ask you. You wound up shooting heroin, 30, 40 times a day? And some people have been disbelieving of that, and I want to say that was not what I was doing every day, but there were certainly days, and it was the coke that was much more compulsive, and because we were selling coke, I had coke around all the time, so, I would just shoot up every 10 minutes. And so you can easily get up to those kinds of numbers if you're doing that. And I get that. I totally get that. But I have to ask you about heroin use. First of all, heroin use today has reached epidemic proportions in so many cities and towns. It's just insane. Absolutely. It's a very cheap drug to get versus probably when you were doing it, it was probably a whole lot more expensive. But help me understand this. Why would a seemingly intelligent, young, well-educated person, knowing what they know about heroin, and yes, I know you say that not all people who shoot heroin become addicted, but many do. Why would you even risk that first time? Putting a needle in one's arm, I don't even get that. That to me right there is you're a little wacko.
The thing that people need to understand, first of all, I started by snorting it.
Okay.
But I felt like I had been lied to about drugs. I was told that marijuana was going to make me insane. And that, once I took X amount of acid, my brain would be gone. And basically, I was told a lot of propaganda about drugs. So I didn't necessarily believe stuff, that I heard about it anymore. Did I realize that heroin was dangerous? First of all, I was also told that cocaine was not addictive. And that was such a popular belief in the 1980s that in 1982, I believe it was, Scientific American said that powder cocaine is no more addictive than potato chips. Of course, now we think potato chips are especially addictive, but back then that was seen as an outrageous statement, especially since that was sort of right before crack began taking off. So the cultural climate around it was different. At that time, though, heroin was seen as a very, very dire and deadly and, serious drug that could kill you. And I knew that, but I had just been suspended from Columbia, and I thought my life was over anyway, so I basically was like,
okay.
All
right, and I think that's an important point to raise because I think we have to understand just how this process works, Well,
and despair is a huge part of why we're seeing so much heroin use today. I think that, a lot of times, people have this idea that you go to a doctor and you get turned into an addict, and that really isn't what happens. 75% of the time, people who are misusing prescription drugs are misusing somebody else's prescription.
So these people are not pain patients. They are recreational drug users, and they have become sort of serious, heavy recreational drug users who are into experimenting with various pills because the middle class is falling apart. They don't really have much hope for the future. And, we're seeing sort of a similar thing in the white community to the despair that was seen in the black community during the crack epidemic. And so we're seeing epidemic levels in white people now.
Right. A couple of things I just quickly wanted to refer to. For me, listen, they told me shoot heroin, deal with heroin, snort heroin, you're getting addicted. That was enough for me. I never went down that road, and I was a child of the drug years too. Who wasn't? Okay, there's that. And then the second thing is, I have to ask you this. When you did get into heavy heroin use, is there something to the ritual of it that is part of the addiction?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely do. And, I was always a very compulsive person anyway. I think, I have been diagnosed with OCD, which I probably think is, at this point, is probably more of a Aspie thing than a actual OCD, but who knows? The symptoms are the same.
Right.
But yes, it was definitely, it was the thing for me about heroin, and the reason heroin is attractive to people is that if you have this kind of oversensitivity to emotions and stimulation, it chills that out. It makes you feel loved and safe and warm, and everybody wants to feel that way. Now, I want to qualify that by saying that this is only the case for about 30% of people who take opiates. The rest of people who take opiates are kind of like, they're either awful or they're kind of meh. So you have to be a person who gets this feeling from opiates, and that is not all people, and that's important to realize because that's a good thing, and that means that, if you do happen to need them for pain, your odds of getting addicted are relatively low. But the thing is that for those people who love them, they are much more likely to be addictive, which sounds kind of obvious, but isn't, people just sort of have this impression that anybody who tries it gets this amazing euphoria. And a lot of people who try it just get this feeling of, I feel horribly numb and disconnected from the world, and this is awful. And I find it kind of comparable to the way that people react to antidepressants. Like, I take Prozac, and it gives me a little bit of distance and a little bit of sort of separation and a little bit less oversensitivity. Another person might take it and feel like I'm numb, I have no feelings, it's awful. It all depends on your baseline.
That is interesting. Let's go down just a little bit more of this thing so that people understand the difference between somebody who is addictive and somebody who isn't. And I think that is critical to everything that you're writing about in this wonderful book of yours. That sense of euphoria, the first time you felt it?
Yes.
Right? Changed your world. Changed your world. Had to have changed your world because everything before that, you never felt that good.
I mean, yeah, like it's a very weird thing because it did, I was always just, for some reason, I couldn't take in the love and affection that people actually had for me. And I had extremely high levels of self-hatred because I just thought, because I couldn't connect, I was bad. And a lot of my recovery has been about getting rid of that self-hatred so that it's not so unbearable to be who I am. And once you get rid of sort of hating yourself and hating yourself for hating yourself, which is the real killer, you can then, it's then not so painful to be in your own skin, and then you don't need the drugs anymore. So, what I tried to do in the book, addiction is about kind of iterative learning where you learn something and then it gets embedded and then you learn something else and it sort of, grows on itself. So it's very, there are certain things that kids will think about themselves that a parent would never want their child to think, but you don't know that they're thinking it because they never express it.
Right.
And, my parents were not bad parents. They were, excellent parents. My dad did have depression because he was a Holocaust survivor, which is not surprising you would have depression.
Of course. Also
Hungarian, which has high rates of depression anyway. And my mom, was sort of dealing with the 70s and being a woman and,
right.
So I don't know. I don't blame them. I don't think that, yes, you get your genes from your parents, but that's hardly...
Yeah, right. You can't blame a parent for your genes.
But, I think that, I interpreted my experience in ways that was painful. And so then,
I faced that pain and was very isolated from people. I mean, I really wish that I had been diagnosed with Asperger's or something as a child. My parents never let me know about the ADHD diagnosis until I was working on this book, in fact. But I wish I had known that, because I hopefully would have thought that I was just sick, not bad.
Yeah, no, I get that. You know, those days we didn't tell our children what we tell them these days. So here's another important part of your story that I think is also part of this whole concept that you've come up with, and that is, how did you get to sobriety, and was it intervention, readiness, the courts, which you had gone through that mess? Is it the old adage that you have to hit bottom in order to recover? Is that true? Right.
No,
you know what I'm saying? So let's go there. Let's talk about this, because I know a lot of people not only who never recovered but wound up dying from...
Well, and that's, yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the concept of bottom is terrible and can be deadly, because the problem is that it's really a turning point in a tale of sin and redemption. It's not a scientific concept. It's a concept that can only be defined retrospectively. So, like, if I say I hit bottom and then I relapse, well, then I have a new bottom, and then you get to bottoms with trapdoors and all kinds of nonsense like this. So the reality about addiction for most people is that it's not that they haven't suffered enough, it's that they don't have any hope of any alternative. For me also, I recovered when I was 23, and I feel like a lot of what happened, you know, I had been arrested 2 years prior to that, and I was like using drugs even more because I was so stressed out about potentially being in prison for 15 years. So that obviously didn't deter me, and it certainly should have if I had been thinking rationally. So, you know, the thing of addiction is it's defined as compulsive behavior despite negative consequences. So if punishment worked to fix it, it kind of wouldn't exist. So this is part of why the idea of bottom is so dangerous, because there are people that you can just punish and punish and punish, and they'll just get worse and worse and worse until they die. What people with addiction actually need is love and support and being told that you can get better. So is that what happened with you? Somebody actually broke through and you were able to get it? Is there an aha moment? Me, like, you know, I actually did do the 12-step thing because it was the only thing that was offered to me. I decided, you know, one day I realized that, you know, the drugs weren't working. My life was getting worse. I was about to do things that horrified me. And so I called my parents and asked to go into treatment. And I'd been resistant to treatment for a really long time because I thought accurately that treatment often involved breaking people down, trying to force them to hit bottom by humiliating and attacking them. And that was basically my worst nightmare. That was why I was doing drugs, to escape, you know, feeling socially isolated and scapegoated. So the idea that that would be treatment was horrifying to me. And the fact that that is treatment in so many cases is still horrifying to me. In fact, I wrote an earlier book about where that idea comes from and why that is harmful. But anyway, fortunately, I went to a reasonably non-confrontational rehab, and it was your sort of traditional 28-day, 12-step based program. And because I was told by doctors and authorities that this is the only way you can recover, I embraced it. And I found some stuff in it very, very useful. I also found some stuff in it, you know, problematic because, you know, people would say everything happens for a reason. And be like, really? Like, God put the Holocaust in my father's path for a reason? Like, I just can't go there.
Right. I get it. I totally get it. Right. Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it was like, you know, I can't say that this is the only way I could have possibly recovered the way some people say about the 12 steps, because I don't have like 20 identical twins who went through different versions. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So I just can't, you know, I can't say that. I can just say that, like, I know that the thing that was helpful for, you know, the things that seemed to make the difference for me were getting a sense of hope, getting a sense that, you know, I could be capable of loving and being loved, and that I could potentially find my way back into the life that I had originally thought of myself as having. So, you know, it was really hope. And it was also, I think, you know, I was 23 when I got into recovery, and that's an age when the frontal cortex of the brain is sort of finishing development. So it's possible that the reason that I got into recovery at that point was nothing to do with what I was thinking and a lot to do with the fact that now I was capable of saying no, of resisting urges and of actually getting better because that frontal area that, is responsible for self-control was finally developed.
Right. You were listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today is the author of Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, Maia Szalavitz. Stay with us. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. Share the link to the show with your friends or my show's player. And I would love it even more if you'd recommend they visit my website at hallicasserjayne.com. I look forward to seeing all of you there. And we are back on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today is the author of Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, Maia Szalavitz. A little rat hole. Let's go down this one real quickly. There is a long-standing belief that drug use is progressive. Smoke grass, and it's a slippery slope, baby, to hard drugs. What are your thoughts?
I kind of, most Hell's Angels started with tricycles, but that doesn't mean every tricyclist is a future Hell's Angel. Correlation is not cause. And I think the more likely explanation for the fact that you do see this somewhat typical progression is that, first of all, most people do not progress. But second of all, that you start with the things that are most available. And then if you're interested in drugs, just like if you're interested in wine, you're not going to just try Bordeaux. You're going to go for some Sauvignon Blancs, and some people who are interested in an area obsessively are going to want to try different aspects of that area. So I think, and people who are desperate for escape are going to try multiple routes for escape. So I think, that's a really important way of understanding it, because the idea that, some things are stepping stone to other things, like, why? Like, first of all, if you look at, in Holland, where they've had basically quasi-legal marijuana for a really long time, fewer people go on to harder drugs, which is, of course, the opposite of what you would expect if making it more available would create a gateway effect. So if there is a gateway effect, the one that there is would be, oh, I sell marijuana. I also sell Coke. Would you like to try it?
Fascinating, yeah.
So that's completely social. But I think that, if you look at the people who get addicted to whatever, like whether it's sex, drugs, rock and roll, or carrots, yes, you can actually get addicted to carrots. People tend to have pre-existing issues. And the people who don't have pre-existing mental illness or personality disorders or trauma or some combination of all of those things or just severe despair, if you don't have those things, maybe you might have some extreme gene that makes you overwhelmingly likely to get addicted if you meet a particular drug, but usually you can tell why some people get addicted.
You do this brain scan trip in the book. Don't want to give all the story away because she tells you at the end what the story is. But I do want to ask you this. I mean, is there or could there be a way that diagnostics could actually tell? I mean, if we start doing medicine and we treat, mental health as part of our everyday routine when we go to the doctor, which we don't right now. It's like the last thing that comes in. Show us your symptom and then we'll treat you. Not, let's just see whether or not this is something that we can see is kind of